am delighted to welcome Regius Professor Emeritus of Modern History at Oxford University, Sir John Elliott. Sir John graduated from Trinity College, Cambridge with an undergraduate degree in history in 1952 and achieved his doctorate in 1955. Sir John was assistant lecturer and lecturer at Cambridge from the mid-1950s until 1968, when he became Professor of History at King's College London. In 1973, he joined the faculty of the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, and in 1990 he became Regius Professor at Oxford until his well-earned retirement in 1997. He is a Fellow of the British Academy, the recipient of many awards and titles, including the Balzan Prize in History and Knighthood in 1994 for services to history, and the Grand Cross of Alfonso the Wise. Sir John is one of the leading historians, if not the leading historian, on Catalonia, the Atlantic empires of England and Spain, and early modern composite monarchies. I was honoured to attend a launch for his 2018 book, Scots and Catalans, which has been invaluable in researching Stuart rule over the three kingdoms. Before we begin, I should point out that this interview was conducted in a public space, and while I've tried to clean up the audio as best I can, you may hear the occasional baby or distant siren. I've also re-recorded a few of my questions for clarity's sake. Hopefully these don't detract too much from the interview, as it was an incredibly fascinating conversation. Please enjoy. So to begin, what was it about Imperial Spain and early modern Catalonia that first caught your interest?
Well, I first went to Spain as an undergraduate in my first long vacation from Cambridge, and with a whole party of undergraduates who'd hired bought an old army lorry, and we went round the Iberian Peninsula for about 6 weeks, and I was very impressed by the country itself, the cities, and in particular by the Prado. I always had a great interest in painting, and seeing the Velázquez there, and particularly the Velázquez, the great equestrian portrait of the Count Duke of Olivares, who was the favourite and first minister of Philip IV of Spain from 1621 until his fall from power in 1643, I thought there might be here an interesting subject for research if I were ever to become a historian. In fact, at that stage I had no idea that I was going to become a professional historian, but it was the back of my mind as an interesting country, one that my compatriots at that stage were not visiting very much because it was the aftermath of the Civil War, and there was a whole generation that wasn't prepared to go to Franco's Spain. So when I got my BA in 1952, the end of my 3 years as an undergraduate, I decided to go on and research, and I said to Professor Herbert Butterfield, who was the professor of modern history at the time, that I would like to work on Spain, and he was delighted because nobody was, particularly early modern Spain. And because it was the 17th century that attracted me particularly, and the Count Duke of Olivares as a 17th century statesman, and this was known traditionally as the period of the decline of Spain, I thought this would be an interesting topic at a moment when people were also talking about the decline of Britain in the post-war period, with the victory in the Second World War, but the loss and the dismantling of empire in the 50s. So that both for the reasons of the world in which I was living at that moment, the society in which I was living, and also the intrinsic, what seemed to me the intrinsic interest of a subject which really hadn't been well studied by Spanish historians, because they were more interested in the great age of Spanish political power from Ferdinand Isabella in the late 15th century, Charles V, and then Philip II. And the dynasty after that, Philip III, who reigned from 1598 to 1621, Philip IV, the monarch who interested me already from 1621 until his death in 1665, and then the miserable Carlos II, with whom the dynasty, the male line of the dynasty was extinguished when he died in 1700. Those known as the Lesser Austrias by Spanish historians. That was the period that most attracted my attention, on which least work had been done. So after I started to learn Spanish, I began to look in my first Spanish manuscripts in what was then the British Museum and now the British Library. I went to Spain for a year to the archive, first of all to the great archive of Simancas, which is near the city of Valladolid, northwest of Madrid. And I started looking for Olivares' papers. I wanted to find out about his domestic reform program, because he appeared to be a man who was trying to reform Spain and rescue it after what he saw as a period of decline of power, decline of reputation under Philip III and his favourite, the Duke of Lerma. And after a little time in the Simancas archives, I wasn't finding much paper material which would tell me about the reform program and his domestic policies. I hit on a recent book in the archive and the library of Simancas, of the Simancas archive, by the Duke of Alba about his family papers. And I read there something which I wasn't aware of at all, that Olivares, when he fell from power, took with him the papers covering his period in power. They went into a family archive, which was then absorbed into the archive of the Dukes of Alba through family connections in the later 17th century. And there was an enormous fire in that archive in the late 18th century, and most of his documentation was destroyed. So at that point I seemed to have lost my subject, which was, you can imagine the sort of what a graduate student who had to come back and do his thesis, hoping to find a great treasure trove of material, of rich material. And I couldn't just go back to Cambridge in despair. I had to look around and see if there was something I could do that would keep me within the period. And as I thought about it, there were two great domestic events during the reign during the tenure of power of Olivares: the revolt of Catalonia in the spring of 1640, and the revolt of Portugal, which was really a coup d'etat in Lisbon in December of 1640. So I could either turn east to Lisbon or west to Catalonia. And by the grace of God, I went west to Catalonia. I'd already had contacts with one or two Catalan historians. There was a Catalan in exile in Cambridge, Batista i Roca, who'd told me about the interest of Catalan history. So I went off to Catalonia, which has a marvellous archive, the archive of the Crown of Aragon. And there I found a massive amount of material of the Council of Aragon covering the first half century of the 17th century. And so I was able to reconstruct in the next year or so for my PhD thesis and for a research fellowship at Trinity. I was able to reconstruct the policies adopted by Madrid to Catalonia up to the beginnings of the revolt of 1640, and at the same time see something of the reactions of the Catalans in that period. I got a junior research fellowship at Trinity College, my college in Cambridge. On the strength of this, I went back to Catalonia for another year in 1954 to 5, realizing that I'd got much more official documentation than local documentation. So I went around Catalonia the best part of a year, looking into municipal archives, church archives and so on, trying to find out more about the reactions of Catalan society to Madrid, to the overwhelming power of Castile, and to Olivares' attempts to mobilize Catalan resources, manpower and money for Spain's great struggle to preserve its position in the course of the 30 Years' War, attempt to consolidate and save the Spanish, the revolt of the Netherlands, cut down on the revolt of the Netherlands, and support Flanders with the Spanish army of Flanders, support the Emperor in his struggles in Central Europe and the 30 Years' War, and to fight off the French, with whom Spain entered into open war in 1635. So that was the background to my study, got me very interested in the history of this period. I published in 1963 the result of those researches as a book which was a revision of my doctoral thesis called The Revolt of the Catalans. And that same year, I was lecturing, giving my first lecture course in Cambridge, and a publisher approached me. And in that same year, he published the lecture course, somewhat revised, as a small book, Imperial Spain, which has been used a great deal since then by generations of students.
So what was the connection between your initial interest in Spain and the political unions you've studied since? I'm particularly thinking about your recent work on England and Scotland.
At that time, of course, I hadn't even begun to think about Scotland. Like so many English historians, I knew nothing about Scotland except for the Battle of Bannockburn and Culloden. So this has been actually a pretty recent interest, but it arose really out of a much larger mental framework that I was developing for myself at this stage, which was the whole idea of composite monarchies. Because so much I began to realize as I looked at Spain, with this diversity of peoples and societies and kingdoms within the Spain of the House of Austria, the Habsburg Spain, I began to realize this didn't really follow the story, which was the story of so much, as presented by historians, the story of so much European history from 1500 up to today, which tended to think in terms of the gradual establishment and consolidation of centralized, uniform, unitary nation states. And I began to realize that Spain simply didn't fit into this model at all. So I began to think about the whole structure of Spain, began to realize that other parts of Europe, like the Holy Roman Empire, for instance, were also very pluralist societies. And looking at the British Isles too, and this is something I discussed, for instance, with Conrad Russell, beginning to realize too that the British Isles could be seen as a composite monarchy, with the incorporation by the English, different stages, obviously first of all of Wales, then of Ireland, insofar as Ireland was conquered in the 16th century, Kingdom of Ireland. Scotland, which remained outside this, but would be incorporated as a dynastic union with the accession of James VI to the English throne and to the throne of what he would call Great Britain in 1603. And this was a form of incorporation which was a very close parallel, in fact, to the incorporation of Catalonia and the Crown of Aragon, which consisted of the Principality of Catalonia, the kingdoms of Aragon and Valencia, and their overseas territories in Italy, Sardinia, for instance. The incorporation through dynastic union on what was really as a result of a bargain, as it were, between the elites of the Spanish elite under Ferdinand Isabella and the elites of these other peripheral kingdoms. And under the system of composite monarchies that developed in Spain, and indeed as it would develop after the Anglo-Scottish dynastic union of 1603, that was a system under which the united part, if it was a lesser entity, it still had nominally parity of status, and it preserved its existing system, its existing laws, its existing system of government, insofar as this was possible. But of course, when you have, as you had in Spain and as you had in England and Britain post 1603, a more powerful society and kingdom, in one instance Castile and the other in England, inevitably there was a tendency for a drift of power to the capital, to Madrid in one instance, to London in the other. And that meant a degree of absentee kingship. So that although Scotland nominally came in with parity of status, in practice, James VI and first was by and large an absentee monarch, although he did come back once. Charles I, equally an absentee monarch. And royal absenteeism is a critical part of the story of composite monarchies. It sets up tensions because obviously the lesser political entity feels in some way unfairly done by, is expecting equality of status and thinks it deserves it, as indeed it did. It still holds on to its laws, liberties, institutions, etc., but feels a sense of grievance. And you begin to feel the tensions, but already it's slightly under James VI and first, but much more under Charles I. Just as in Spain, you already are aware of them under Philip III in the first 2 decades of the 17th century, but which become much greater in the 1620s and 30s as a result of Olivares' attempts to mobilize the resources of Spanish society for his overseas wars.
So was James aware that his Scottish subjects resented his move south, and did he try and alleviate these tensions at all?
He was very well aware of this, just as he was equally well aware of English resentments at the appearance of a large number of hungry, penurious Scotsmen looking for places at the royal court, unbounded wealth in their eyes compared with what they'd been used to in Scotland. So you have these tensions from the beginning, which sets up very strong anti-Scottish feelings in London among the English elite, very strong anti-English feelings among members of the Scottish elite who feel that they're not getting a fair deal. And James is extremely anxious. He would like to introduce a degree of uniformity in this new country which he calls Great Britain. He wants to work in that direction, but he's pretty canny and cautious. As I see it, he knows at bottom that what's really needed is a union of hearts and minds. And to bring about a union of hearts and minds is going to be a slow process. But at the same time, he has to persuade the Scots that their laws and so on won't be changed as a result of the union, that their ecclesiastical arrangements won't be changed, and at the same time he has to reassure the English that he's not going to ride roughshod over traditional, over the common law, for instance, or over English institutions in any way. So there's that uneasiness in the relationship of which James is very conscious. He makes these high-sounding speeches trying to establish the idea of an imperial crown, but it doesn't go down well either with the House of Commons or with the Scots. So, and at the same time, he probably goes farther than he should have done as regards the church. He'd always had his troubles, of course, with the Scottish Presbyterian Church. episcopacy is pretty ambiguous as a status. The bishops have a pretty ambiguous position, as we all know, in the Presbyterian Church in the early 17th century. He tries to introduce these articles of Perth, which would bring things slightly closer to the Anglican establishment, and in a sense reinforce the power of the bishops, and these do not go down well in Scotland. So that, in a sense, he leaves a difficult legacy, but not an impossible legacy as I see it, for Charles I. And Charles, as we all know, blew it all, in the sense that he, when he goes to Scotland, he's pretty ignorant, I think, of the realities of Scottish life, which of course James was very well acquainted with. And Charles, by trying to introduce a closer relationship between the Anglican Church and the Scottish Church, trying to introduce tighter discipline of the Scottish Church, the Kirk, and also to change the liturgy in directions and the prayer book in directions which infuriated the Scottish Presbyterian Kirk. He was really set on a path that would lead him to disaster, and his handling of the whole situation was, of course, disastrous. You get the outbreak of the First Bishops' War and then the Second Bishops' War. And it's interesting that outbreak between 1638 and 41 coincides exactly with the Catalan outbreak of 1640. So that you've got here the Catalan situation is not primarily religious. There are certain religious elements in the Catalan rising, particularly the sacrilege in church in Catalan churches by non-Spanish soldiers and so on. But this was much more a rising against taxation, mobilization of manpower, etc., with the Spanish army in the country. Whereas you could say that the Scottish Rising is, in the first instance, a religious one. But there's, in my view, and I've tried to show this in my new book, Scots and Catalans, I've tried to show, in fact, how, as I see it, at the bottom of both those struggles, the Catalan and the Scottish, there's a struggle for the preservation of the collective identity of a people which feels itself to be under threat from a more powerful and in some ways alien neighbour, England in one instance and Castile in the other. So that it's a desperate attempt by both societies, in which the Scots do much better at the beginning because they have an army which goes to London. They intervene, of course, in the English civil wars on the side of the parliamentarians, whereas the Catalans have no army of their own, are not in a position. They want to influence, they want to bring about the downfall of Olivares, but they simply, and they're in touch with opposition figures in Madrid, but they simply don't have the weight that the Scots had in 1640, 41, 42 to intervene. So what happens, and it's very interesting, is that the Catalans declare themselves an independent republic. They break their allegiance to Philip IV at the end of 1640. They declare themselves an independent republic, and that republic lasts for exactly 1 week, because the Spanish royal army is at the gates of Barcelona by this time to reconquer the city of Barcelona. The Catalans have called in the French for help. The French say they'll only give help if the Catalans switch their allegiance from Philip IV or from being an independent republic to allegiance to Louis XIII of France. So after 1 week the Catalan Republic disappears, Catalonia becomes a protectorate and a satellite of France, and the French managed to keep the Catalan revolt going until 1652, and then internal problems in France, domestic troubles of the Fronde, they lose interest in continuing their support. So Barcelona surrenders in 1652. Catalonia returns, the Principality of Catalonia returns to allegiance to Philip IV, and Philip IV himself promises to observe their laws and liberties, which Olivares, in the view of the Catalans, had trampled over in the 1630s. So we return to the status quo ante, or something pretty much like it, in Catalonia post-1652. Scotland, of course, is a somewhat different story in the sense that we get the Cromwellian invasion and Cromwellian attack, invasion, the attempt to a closer incorporation by Cromwell of Scotland into the British polity, with Scottish MPs becoming part of the House of Commons and so on. That, of course, all collapses with the regime, Cromwellian regime. Charles II comes back as king both of Scotland and England in 1660, and again we return to what is roughly the status quo ante. But both those events, I think, have left deep scars and deep memories in the two societies. The scars created by in Scotland by the Cromwellian invasion in particular, and the Cromwellian attempt at closer incorporation. There are the scars left in Catalonia by the uprising itself, the suppression of that uprising. And at the same time, there are memories. There are memories in Catalonia of the week when we were a republic. There are memories in Scotland of the moment when we really had power in London and were shaping or reshaping, or hoping to reshape, both the English political structure and the English religious system in the course of the 1640s. So that those scars and memories will linger on for the next centuries and will be taken up at certain points, as I see it, in the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries and 21st centuries, when they look relevant in one way or another.
You mentioned that initially the conflict between Scotland and England in the mid-17th century was primarily religious in nature. Was there any hope in the Scottish Kirk that James would use his new position in the Church of England to continue the Reformation south of the border, to spread Presbyterianism?
I think they were more concerned at that moment to preserve themselves. But I think the opportunities arose at the end of the 1630s. I think that's the moment when they said, we can make a really godly society. But there's this sense of Scotland as a chosen nation, which the Kirk has given them, and that sense of being a chosen people, in that sense superior to the English, plays a very important part, as I see it, in the construction of the Scottish mentality of the 17th and 18th centuries.
Did the tensions between the Scots and the English at court and in Edinburgh stem solely from the current political situation that they found themselves in? Or were historical events, like the rough wooing or even as far back as the Wars of Independence, a further addition to this tension?
I think the Scots felt themselves to be a chosen people, and that's very important. And the English also felt themselves to be a chosen people. So you've got two chosen people in conflict, effectively. The English have triumphed with the defeat of Spain at the Armada, and I think that the Anglo-Spanish conflict of the 16th century has reinforced the sense of English nationhood, just as I think the Union of the Crowns reinforced the sense of Scotland as a distinctive chosen people. And there are these memories going back, of course, right to the Edward I's attempts at conquest. And that sense of we've beaten the English, and the English failed to conquer us during the 13th, 14th, 15th and 16th centuries. The incidents like the rough wooing and so on, but we've survived, and we are a chosen nation. God is looking with particular benignity on us. And that, I think, is very important and has remained latent, and not always so latent, in Scottish society, just as the sense of being a chosen people has dominated so much of the English mentality right up to the middle and late 20th century.
So, Sir John, you mentioned that the Anglo-Spanish Wars were particularly useful in forming, or perhaps reinforcing, an English identity. Now, obviously, the Anglo-Spanish War was immensely profitable for many English elites because it was primarily a naval war. One of James's first acts was to bring this war to an end. Was this itself a source of conflict, his shutting off of this profitable source of income?
It depends who we're talking about. I think that both England and Spain were war-weary countries by the 1590s. You have to remember that England was also fighting an extremely expensive war in Ireland at the same time. So it was an exhausted country, just as Spain had overreached imperially in many ways, and with the accession of new monarchs on both thrones, 1598 in Spain, 1603 in England, it was a time for rethinking. And James saw himself as the great conciliator. I mean, he was going to be the European King Solomon, who would reconcile the warring peoples and the warring religions. So he was very much bent on the idea of peace with Spain, and there were those around him who also supported the idea, whereas at the same time there were groups in English society, mercantile groups, former corsairs and so on, those who looked back to the great days of Elizabeth, which were beginning soon start to recede into memory, who thought that this was a cowardly reaction, that this was the moment to strike at Spain if possible. And of course, there were memories here of English colonizing ventures, the Roanoke colony of the 1580s, which was really scuppered in part by the local situation, but also by the advent of the Armada, the impossibility of reinforcing the colony at a critical moment. So there were memories of overseas colonization. At the same time, a realization that Spanish power ultimately rested on this constant flow of silver from the mines of Mexico and Peru to Seville, which was what paid the Spanish army of Flanders, paid for Spanish domination of Europe in the late 16th, early 17th centuries. So this seemed a good moment to people like Walter Raleigh, who had memories and wanted to pursue and retain the greatness and the colonizing projects of the later 16th century. They were resentful of James's policies, but of course an Anglo-Spanish treaty was negotiated in 1604, that wonderful group portrait in the National Portrait Gallery of the two teams negotiating with each other, which produced the Anglo-Spanish Treaty. That was followed by the Northumberland's visit to Spain in 1605 with an enormous entourage, English entourage. So for the first time, a large number of the English elite, or a substantial number among the English elite, came face to face with the realities of Spain, and were at once impressed and were aware also of the nature of Spanish power. But there were it seemed to be that there were real opportunities. Spain, in the 1604 treaty, the English had wanted access to the Indies, to Spanish America. That had been absolutely turned down. And therefore it was a question of trying to get a base or set up a colony in the Americas, which will be outside the area of effective Spanish occupation, although the Spaniards claimed the whole thing. And this would lead to negotiations and the formation of the Virginia Company, the attempt to establish a colony in Virginia in 1607. And that colony, in fact, had a very rocky history. As we know, it nearly failed very early on. They didn't find the silver they hoped to find, and of course the concept of America in English eyes was primarily the concept of silver. And there were no silver mines in Virginia. And it was very difficult for them to feed themselves and so on. The whole project nearly collapsed. The Spanish Council of State thought about the possibility of sending an expedition to a military naval expedition just to wipe out the English settlement, which is what had happened with the French settlement in the 1560s, when a Spanish expedition simply slaughtered the French, the Huguenot attempt at a colony. But there were interesting debates in the Spanish Council of State, in which it was decided that really it was so trivial, the thing, that it was likely to die of its own weaknesses, and there was no point in devoting money to a special expedition when there were so many other calls on the Spanish crown finances at that moment. And of course this proved to be a terrible miscalculation, because nobody at that point realized that in tobacco there was a potential source of enormous wealth for the new Virginia colony. And as soon as tobacco begins to grow there, and you begin to realize that you can use slaves from Africa to cultivate the tobacco, and that realization comes as early as 1621. From that moment, Virginia has the prospect of becoming a growing concern. I mean, there are terrible moments for it, but it survives those first initial steps. And by the 1620s and 30s, the English are there, and the Spaniards are so involved in their European conflicts. This is very much on the margins of their interests, and not much can be done. And of course, this was a fatal decision. And then, of course, the English had always seen their colonies both as colonial projects and as bases for attacks on Spanish power. And there were English attacks in the Caribbean in the 1630s and 40s. Cromwell would take up the whole Elizabethan scheme, project for colonization and war against Spain, with the attempt to capture Hispaniola in 1655, which was a complete failure, but with the conquest of Jamaica, which gave us a Caribbean base. So that the stories gradually of the English penetration and the Dutch penetration and then the French penetration of the Caribbean in the first instance, the Spanish mainland territories where there is effective Spanish settlement, on the whole are well protected or sufficiently well protected to deter successful attacks. But the writing is on the wall already in the 1630s and 40s.
So, going back to the accession of James, in Scots and Catalans you mention the very interesting point that the English experience of political union up to this point was one of imbalance. A dominant power, England, either conquering or otherwise annexing Wales and then Ireland. And that this built the English idea of political union as one where a dominant power dominated a minor power. Now, obviously, if you want to see James's accession in a particular way, Scotland was the dominant power. A Scottish king became King of England. What was the English reaction to the idea that there was now another parliament on the island of Britain that was, theoretically, an equal?
Well, of course, there was still an Irish parliament as well. So it was, in many ways, a parliamentary composite monarchy, although with the dominance of England, and the Welsh, of course, had been absorbed into the House of Commons. So that it's an asymmetrical system, and it stays as such right up to 1707. And we might perhaps talk about 1707 here, because I think it is it's the point of great divergence with what happens in Spain, if you want to follow that, that story. Because it seems to me to be a very interesting example of the functioning of composite monarchy. Because what effectively 1707 does, it's a treaty nominally between two sovereign powers, sovereign states, the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland. So that Queen Anne, as Queen of England, is signing a treaty with Queen Anne as Queen of Scotland. I'm still wanting to know how exactly the ceremony occurred. I mean, they didn't have Olivia Colman to play the other part in this. But anyhow, the 1707 was a treaty between two equal powers. And as we all know, under that arrangement, the Scots got what they most wanted, which was access to English overseas trade and the English overseas empire. And that was at a moment when the Scottish economy was in the real doldrums with the Darien venture and so on. And so it was, in a sense, it was the elite saw this as the way out, the way of survival. And of course it meant surrendering a Scottish Parliament, sending 45 Scots to the English House of Commons, a number of Scottish peers, but in return for that, access to British political life of what is now United Kingdom, and access to overseas trade and overseas colonisation. And the Scots make an enormous amount of this, and of course become pioneers in empire building in the 18th and 19th centuries.
You mentioned that the Scots are locked out of the English imperial system until 1707, but with James the first thing that comes to mind is the Ulster plantation, an attempt to bridge the gap between the English and the Scots by having them mix in Ulster. Now obviously it doesn't go well for a whole host of reasons. They separate into their own communities and there was very little mixing involved. But were there any other attempts, either by James or by Charles, to try and get the English and the Scots involved together in empire?
I think not at that stage. I mean, the English are very wary of letting anybody else in. I think it's Sir William Alexander has this plan for a Scottish colony in America in the 1620s, which again doesn't get off the ground. But it's not an Anglo-Scottish colony. The Scots, of course, will infiltrate, but in a sense, no, that integration, other than the failed attempt at integration in Ulster, doesn't work. And just as a customs union, which comes in at the beginning, doesn't work because the Scots are losing the customs revenues, the Scottish customs collectors, so there's an objection there. Just as exactly the same thing happens with the union of Spain and Portugal in 1580, when again they attempt a customs union, and the customs dues are sufficiently important, nobody wants to surrender them. So that possible areas of integration like that simply fail for pragmatic reasons very often. And this innate hostility, and I think it is hostility between Scots and English at certain points, at certain critical moments.
That bridges perfectly into my next question. In Scots and Catalans, you mentioned James attempting a rebranding of the borders as the Middle Shires, which I think is wonderfully quaint and a little bit naive. How well did that attempt fare?
Badly. No, it just doesn't work. It seems to work first time, but control of the borders had always been a problem for the King of the Scots and for the English. And my own ancestors were flung out of the border country, I think in probably the 16th century, these internal rivalries. And until you get a civilizing process among some of these border nobility, just as in the Highlands, and this is going to take time. You get these constant tensions, this difficulty of imposing control, whether from Edinburgh or from London. And I think border security diminishes after, in the 1620s, already in the later years of James VI and I.
That is interesting, because on the podcast we've already discussed the civilising those rude parts, talking about the attempts by the English and the Scots to bring their wild parts, their borderlands, to heel. It certainly seemed like the very nature of the borderlands as a border, as a war zone for many years, made this impossible, and that it was only with a single king controlling both sides of the border that peace was even feasible. But you're saying that it wasn't as simple as that.
No, in my view, not at all. And it is a slow process. And just as the whole question of the Highlands it is a perfect example of, until you can break down these clan rivalries, get the nobles to court, bring them to Edinburgh, and so on, it's very difficult to break those lines of dependence and allegiance, which of course will run right through the 17th century in the Highlands in particular. And the whole question, I mean, one of the things that struck me in writing my book was the tensions between lowland Scotland and Highland Scotland, that in practice this, what is effectively a campaign from the lowlands and from the Kirk to reduce and eventually eliminate Gaelic as the local language. And it's because it's seen as a barbaric language of a barbaric people, and it's a campaign, of course, which will go on right into the 18th century. It takes a long time for lowland Scots to win. It is being lowland Scots is being picked up in certain areas of the Highlands, but it remains, the linguistic problem remains a really serious question, and it becomes, in Catalonia, language becomes the great point of reference for later nationalist movement, whereas the virtual extinction of Gaelic by the end of the 18th century means that language will not become the point of reference for later Scottish nationalism as it does for Catalan nationalism.
That is interesting. So branching out, are there any trends in the field of imperial history more generally that you're particularly interested in? Some current scholarship that's caught your eye?
Well, it's very difficult, and I think historians are finding it very difficult to know exactly the weight of empire in the home countries in the 19th and 20th centuries. How deeply the concept of empire has entered into the mentality of Britons and of Spaniards. But what strikes me particularly in writing this book is the loss of empire in Spain, finally in 1898, which was traumatic because of the great defeat by the United States of Spanish power, and the slower loss of empire in post-1940s Britain reduces the political space in both societies. Once you've dismantled your overseas territories in one way or another, your political space is confined to the domestic scene. And that, I think, probably gives more weight to, you think more about Scotland, Wales, Ireland, etc. The Irish situation, of course, has been critical for right the way through for English history, a total disaster. So that I think it is worth considering that. I think there is a debate, as I understand it, going on at present among those who think the loss of empire is critical for Scottish nationalism, the rise of Scottish nationalism. Those who don't think it's so critical because it wasn't so deeply infused in Scottish society. I don't know what the answer to that is. It needs more investigation. One of the pieces I was reading quite recently, interesting about this, was the way in which the new Commonwealth and the rise of overseas nationalism in British overseas territories may have given an impetus to Scottish nationalism at home. It is possible, I think, that the sense of nationality is reinforced by the attempt to create a new British Commonwealth in which Nigeria and so on are all reinforcing and gathering and developing their sense of a distinctive nationality. If they can do it, why can't the Scots as well?
I may have to look into that for my own thesis. So what's next for you? Obviously, you've only recently published Scots and Catalans, but when we met at the launch last year, you mentioned you were jumping right into your next project.
Well, I was over-optimistic. I'm still recuperating. And I'm giving quite a lot of talks in Spain in particular. The situation in Spain is particularly tense at this moment. And so I'm getting a lot of press interviews and so on. So I really haven't had time to think about other things. I do think what I feel Scottish history needs, English history needs, is comparative history. And I've been trying to pursue the comparative approach right over the course of my career as a professional historian, precisely because I think that without a comparative sense, we're reduced to parochialism and a sense of exceptionalism of our own societies. And Scottish historiography, which seems to me in recent years to be of high quality, again, you notice a certain parochial tendency. They don't compare with what's going on in other societies. So my whole effort has been that. And one way or another, I hope to pursue this and be an evangelist for comparative history. I think I might do more with the history of Portugal, the other side of the peninsula now. But I just wait and see. One gets a sudden moment when one realizes there's something worth doing, and it's a question of how much one's going to commit one's resources to something. I don't feel at this stage of my life that I can spend much time on archival work, but there's so much historical literature has been produced in recent years. There's so much to dominate, to get a handle on, and people get lost in the microhistorical scene very much, or in their own local areas. And my great appeal really is to remember the big picture. There is a wider scene, international, global, and we must think about that international and global perspective at all times. Never forget it.
Those are some incredibly wise words to finish up on. Before we do so, however, aside from the brilliant Scots and Catalans, are there any other publications of yours that you think would be of interest to my listeners?
Well, I'd like to think that my comparative study of British and Spanish America, Empires of the Atlantic World, which came out, I think, in 2006, would be of particular interest, because then I'm trying to do a sustained comparison over 3 centuries from the beginnings of colonization to the independence movements of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, interweaving, comparing, contrasting. And so I would very much hope that some of your listeners will look at that book. I think Imperial Spain seems still to be useful, although it's a young man's book. I couldn't write it now myself. And those of my listeners who are interested in art history, which again needs integrating into the wider historical picture, I'd like to think the book that Jonathan Brown and I wrote together, A Palace for a King, about the Palace of the Buen Retiro in Madrid, constructed for Philip IV as a pleasure palace by Olivares, which had a great series of paintings commissioned, which were now at this moment trying to restore the building in which they were housed in Madrid. I very much hope that those listeners with any aesthetic or artistic interests would also look at A Palace for a King.
I would also heartily recommend Empires of the Atlantic World. I'm finding it incredibly useful in writing the podcast, along with Scots and Catalans, so absolutely give that a read. Thank you very much, Sir John. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Good. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to this special episode of Pax Britannica, and thank you to Sir John Elliott for agreeing to speak with me. Sir John has asked me to correct a very slight slip of the tongue of his when he said the English delegation to Spain in 1605 was led by the Earl of Northumberland, when instead it was the Earl of Nottingham. The recommended books we discussed are Scots and Catalans, Union and Disunion, published in 2018, and Empires of the Atlantic World, Britain and Spain in America, 1492 to 1830, published in 2006. Both have been incredibly useful for writing Pax Britannica, and I would highly recommend them to anyone looking for highly readable books on this period. Thank you again for listening.